It seems Sabrina Ionescu followed her on Instagram yesterday, which is not an ideal scenario for the Indiana Fever if you are competing with the New York Liberty, because everyone's saying, oh, she'll take a hometown discount to, stay near Caitlin because of her business. But it's not like her and Caitlin are suddenly not going to be friends anymore, and you better believe, being in New York.
When Caitlin Clark went on national television and laid out exactly what the Indiana Fever needed to do this offseason, the whole basketball world listened. She named her priorities clearly, she named names, and she sent a message about what the 2026 season was supposed to look like. But there was one name she didn't say, one player whose situation was hanging in the air throughout everything. And the way that contract drama has been unfolding reveals something much bigger about where this franchise is actually headed. Lexie Hull is at the center of it all. And whether she stays or whether another team finds a way to steal her, what happens next will shape Caitlin Clark's 2026 season more than most people realize. To really understand why this matters, you need to know who Lexie Hull actually is. Because if you've only been watching the Fever since Clark arrived, you might have a very incomplete picture of her. Hull was born September 13, 1999 in Liberty Lake, Washington, and grew up playing basketball in the driveway with her identical twin sister Lacey. That's not just a fun detail. The two of them played together through high school, both earning 5-star recruit ratings, and then went to Stanford together, where they helped lead the Cardinal to a national championship in 2022. Hull was a 3-time All-Pac-12 selection. Her twin sister Lacey came off the bench on that same championship squad. It's the kind of backstory that sounds almost too perfect. Two sisters from Spokane, playing in the same gym their whole lives, on finally winning it all together on college basketball's biggest stage. And then Lexie went first overall, 6th overall in the 2022 WNBA draft, taken by the Indiana Fever, even though most projections had her going much later. She's been there ever since. Every single season of her professional career has been in Indiana. And what she became there over 4 years is something that the stat sheet barely captures. The 2025 season is the one that changed the conversation around Hull permanently. And it did it in the hardest possible way, by throwing everything at her and watching her refuse to break. Caitlin Clark got hurt in the early part of the season and was eventually limited to just 13 games all year. Sophie Cunningham, the enforcer who had been brought in specifically to protect Clark and change the team's identity, tore her MCL in August. Ari McDonald went down. Sydney Colson tore her ACL. The Fever were operating at times like a team running on fumes and goodwill. And Lexie Hull showed up to every single one of those 44 regular season games. Not just showed up, started 30 of them, played career-high minutes, and became the person this roster leaned on when everyone else was in the training room. She averaged career highs across every major statistical category: 7.2 points, 4.3 rebounds, 1.8 assists, 1.2 steals per game. She upped her three-point volume and maintained her percentage. And she did all of it while playing through her own pain. There's a photo from late in the season that became symbolic. Hull warming up before a game with 2 visible black eyes after taking a collision in the face during a previous contest. Coach Stephanie White looked at her and said, "It really epitomizes Lexie's toughness." That's not a stat. But every person who saw that photo understood exactly what kind of player this franchise had. And then the playoffs happened, and Hull went from reliable to indispensable. The Fever were a 6th seed with their franchise players sitting in the stands. They had no business advancing far, and they went to the semifinals, pushing the eventual champion Las Vegas Aces all the way to a decisive Game 5 before finally going home. Hull was the engine of that run in ways that don't get enough attention. In the postseason, she averaged over 10 points per game. In Game 3 of the semifinals, she had 16 points and 10 rebounds, a double-double, the first of her playoff career, while playing through a back injury that had been bothering her throughout the series. The WNBA's own official channels singled her out as Indiana's lockdown defender, the player who guarded the opposition's best players and made life miserable for them on the perimeter. Her three-point shooting had become a genuine weapon. Her offensive rebounding, second among all WNBA guards that season, was powering a Fever team that led the league in second-chance points. None of that happens without Lexie Hull. None of the Fever's postseason magic is even possible without her. And heading into 2026, with the CBA finally resolved and the salary cap jumping to $7 million per team, she had every right to expect the kind of payday that reflected everything she had contributed. But whether Indiana could actually deliver that became the most complicated question in the entire offseason. Here's where things get genuinely tense. The Fever entered free agency with only 3 players locked in under contract: Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, and rookie Michaela Timpson. That sounds like a lot of flexibility. And it is. Indiana had roughly $5.5 million in cap space to work with before a single dollar was spent. But then you start adding up what they actually needed to do, and the math gets uncomfortable very fast. Kelsey Mitchell, the 3-time All-Star who was Clark's backcourt partner and had just made first-team All-WNBA, needed to be re-signed. Clark herself went on national television during an NBA on NBC broadcast and said it plainly. Mitchell was the first priority. You saw she was first-team All-WNBA last year. She's kind of my running mate in the backcourt. She makes it really easy for me. Under the new CBA structure, Mitchell was eligible for a core qualifying offer worth $1.4 million for a single season. A supermax contract that also locked her into exclusive negotiations with Indiana. Then there's Aaliyah Boston, who is max eligible through a new provision called EPIC, Exceptional Performance on Initial Contract, allowing her to sign a 3-year max extension starting at $1.19 million annually. And then there's Sophie Cunningham, the unrestricted free agent who had become a folk hero and was looking for a real payday after years of being dramatically underpaid. Run those numbers through the salary cap, and the remaining room for Lexie Hull shrinks down to something that starts to feel uncomfortable. The analysts running the math found that once Mitchell was locked in, the Fever had roughly $3.6 million left over, and that was without accounting for Hull or Cunningham at all. This is the scenario where a player like Lexie Hull can quietly walk out the door without anyone fully anticipating it until it's too late. She was protected in the expansion draft. The Fever were widely believed to have kept their 5 most important non-contract players protected, and Hull was firmly on that list alongside Mitchell, Clark, Boston, and Timpson. But protection from the expansion draft and actual financial retention are 2 different conversations. Being a restricted free agent means Hull can negotiate with any team she wants. She can entertain offer sheets. Other franchises can sit down with her and put real money on the table. Money that reflects how the new CBA has changed what a player of her profile is worth in this league. And Indiana's right of first refusal only protects them if they actually have the cap space to match whatever offer comes in. If the Fever spend big on Mitchell and Boston extensions and Cunningham returns on a significant deal, the math for matching a competitive Hull offer sheet gets tight enough to be genuinely concerning. That's not speculation. Analysts covering the Fever's salary cap situation were explicit about it. The margins get smaller if Hull and Cunningham both come back on substantial raises. There's a version of this offseason where Indiana simply runs out of room. What makes this even more layered is the window into Lexie Hull's personal life and what it tells you about where her head is during all of this. Where in late March 2026, Hull posted photos from Cabo San Lucas in Mexico, a vacation with her fiancé, former professional baseball player Will Mathewson, who she got engaged to in April 2025. The couple has been planning their wedding while both navigating incredibly busy professional schedules. Hull told People magazine late in 2025 that the planning had been both fun and genuinely hard because of how little time either of them had. Caitlin Clark saw the Cabo photos and dropped a comment in the section. "Hot" was the one-word response that sent Clark and Hull fans into a brief shared meltdown of excitement, because that's the dynamic between them. Genuine, fun, the kind of friendship that transcends practice reps and game planning. Clark was at the bachelorette party in Scottsdale earlier in March, and the entire Fever crew had been interacting online throughout the off-season like a group of actual close friends rather than just co-workers. The closeness is real, the chemistry is real, which is exactly why the question of Hull's future felt so loaded, because losing her wouldn't just be a basketball move, it would fracture something personal inside that locker room. And then earlier in the fall, during the middle of the CBA uncertainty, a live podcast conversation surfaced that revealed something fans hadn't accounted for. YouTube host Rosalina Lee was conducting a session, and a viewer dropped a comment speculating that Lexie Hull and several other Fever players might end up on the new Portland Fire in 2026. The guest on the show was Lexie Hull, Lexie's mother. And Jaime's response was immediate and completely unfiltered. She said that Portland would be a 6-hour drive for her, which she was clearly not enthusiastic about. She then compared that to Seattle, which she said was at least better than Seattle. The comment was the kind of thing a parent says when they're reacting honestly before their brain catches up to the fact that they're on a platform with an audience. It told you that these conversations were actually happening in the Hull household. That expansion teams, new destinations, and roster flexibility were real topics being discussed around the family dinner table. And it told you that geography was a real factor in Lexie Hull's decision-making, which either works for Indiana or works against it depending on how aggressively other teams in more attractive markets decide to pursue her. What Clark actually said about Hull specifically in that NBC appearance was, in some ways, the most telling moment of this entire saga. She named Kelsey Mitchell as the explicit first priority. She called Mitchell her running mate. She talked about wanting to contend. She predicted the Fever would be the favorites to win it all in 2026. But she didn't name Lexie Hull in that same breath. She didn't say, "And we need to keep Lexie too." And while it would be easy to read too much into what a player doesn't say in a television appearance, the omission created a ripple. Fever fans noticed. Basketball analysts noticed, because Hull had earned that sentence. She had been the most available player on the roster when everyone else was hurt. She had started all 8 playoff games without Clark in the lineup and put up the best postseason numbers of her career. She had won an unrivaled championship in the off-season 3-on-3 league with Rose BC and continued developing her game away from the WNBA. She had established endorsement deals with Athleta, Sweetgreen, Form, and others. She was building something on and off the court that had real market value. And yet, the public conversation from the Fever's most prominent voice was entirely focused on other priorities. Whether that was strategic, protecting negotiating leverage, not tipping their hand, or whether it genuinely reflected how the front office was weighting its decisions, only the people inside those conversations know. The new CBA that ended the months-long standoff between the league and the players changed every number in this situation significantly. The average salary for 2026 jumped to just over $583,000, with minimum salaries ranging from $270,000 to $300,000 depending on service time. Supermaxes went up to $1.4 million annually. For a player like Lexie Hull, 4 years in the league, career highs across every statistical category, an expansion-era WNBA market where new teams in Portland and Toronto were actively looking to build rosters with proven talent. The payday she could command in April 2026 was genuinely different from anything she'd seen on her rookie deal. And other teams were watching. The Chicago Sky had lost 2 crucial bench players in the expansion draft. The LA Sparks had their own roster gaps to fill. Or any team looking for a wing who could defend at the highest level, hit threes, rebound like a forward, and bring playoff experience to a locker room had every reason to pick up the phone and make an offer. The Fever's right of first refusal was a protection, yes, but it was only useful if they actually had the resources and the will to use it. And with over 100 players across the entire league entering free agency simultaneously, Indiana was operating in one of the most chaotic, unpredictable off-seasons in WNBA history. What Lexie Hull represents for the 2026 Indiana Fever isn't just a contract decision. It's a statement about who this team is when the lights are brightest. The 2025 version of Indiana, battered, undermanned, missing their biggest star, and somehow still standing in the semifinals, was built largely on her back, not Clark's, not Mitchell's. Hull was the one who was out there every single night, going to every film session, fighting for every defensive possession, coming to practice with 2 black eyes and not even blinking about it. Head coach Stephanie White called her a tough kid. The WNBA endorsed her publicly. Fans who had barely known her name before the season started were sharing clips of her taking charges and flying into the stands for loose balls by October. That's the player now sitting at the center of a cap management puzzle that Indiana has to solve before the season tips off in May. And the stakes of getting it wrong go beyond points and assists. Lose Hull, and you lose the glue. The specific, hard-nosed, nothing-bothers-me energy that held the team together when everything else fell apart. That's not easily replaced, even in a league where over 100 names are suddenly available. The restricted qualifying offer the Fever sent on April 7th was a signal that they understood this. It kept Indiana in the game. But whether they can actually close the deal, whether the money is there, whether Hull wants to stay, whether some team from a city her mom is apparently more willing to drive to doesn't make things complicated, that answer was still being written in real time. Caitlin Clark said the Fever were going to be favorites to win it all in 2026. That prediction only holds if the people who made that 2025 miracle run possible are in the building when the 2026 season starts. And right now, Lexie Hull's name on that roster is the most important open question left.